This is WXOJLP Northampton, 103.3 FM, your Valley Free radio station. Welcome. I'm Warren Odess-Gillette, and this is A Baha'i Perspective. A Baha'i Perspective is a radio program that presents a Baha'i perspective on life through interviews. If you want information specifically on the Baha'i faith, you're welcome to visit the website www.baha'i.org. That's BAHAI.org, or you can call the toll-free number 1-800-22-UNITE. Today I'm playing a telephone interview with Brian Lepard, a Baha'i and a professor of law at the University of Nebraska. He is the author of two books, Rethinking Humanitarian Intervention, a fresh legal approach based on fundamental ethical principles in international law and world religions, and his second book is called Hope for a Global Ethic, Shared Principles in Religious Scripture. I started the interview by asking Brian where he grew up, and what was it like growing up there?
Well, actually, I grew up in a number of places. I was born in Hollywood, California, strangely enough.
Uh-huh.
And that's only because my mother's regular doctor was out golfing when she went into labor. So the nearest hospital to our suburb of Los Angeles happened to be in Hollywood.
Okay.
At the Kaiser Hospital. So, but that, for better or for worse, is where I was born. But I then spent the first 6 years of my life in a little suburb of Los Angeles, Montclair, California. Mm-hmm. But then, when I was 6, my father, who was a music teacher at the time.
He was a what?
He was a music teacher, school music teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother was a speech therapist in the school system in California. Mm-hmm. But my father met Dwight Allen, who was at the time a very prominent Baha'i and still is in the field of education. Mm-hmm. And I believe he was at Stanford, but he had just been appointed dean of the School of Education at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Mm-hmm. And he invited my father to come get a doctorate of education under his supervision at UMass. Mm-hmm. So I remember vividly, we had a little VW Bug, and my dad built a trailer, and we attached the trailer to the car and moved all the way from one end of the country to Amherst, Massachusetts.
So this was in the late 60s?
Yeah, this was in 1968, actually. Mm-hmm. And so we camped all the way across the country and eventually wound up in Amherst. And then I spent 3 years there while my dad received his doctorate, worked towards his doctorate. Mm-hmm. So I have a very strong affection for Western Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. And then my father got his first job after his degree with a public school system in Northern Virginia outside Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty much where I spent the rest of my childhood. Okay. And a little development called Dale City, Virginia, which is about 25 miles from Washington.
Mm-hmm. And so you went to middle school or junior high school and then high school there?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I really enjoyed having access to Washington, D.C. I would take the bus in and sit in on Congress just for the fun of it.
Oh, really?
As a child. Yeah.
Wow.
It was a rather unique experience.
Yeah. So what happened after high school?
Well, then I just had to decide where to go to college, and I wound up at Princeton University in New Jersey, and had a tough time deciding what to study, but because of my ideals as a Baha'i, I had a very strong interest in world peace and in the development of international law and international cooperation. So eventually, I found my way to the field of international relations. So I was admitted to the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton, which is actually a special program, even for undergraduates. And so my junior and senior years, I was able to focus on international relations generally, but with a specialization in international organization and also international law. And then from there, I had to decide what to do. I had sworn I'd never go to law school because all my friends were going to law school since they had nothing better to do. And I said, well, that will never be me. And I really wanted to get out in the world. And fortunately, my senior year at Princeton, I had been able to work out an internship with the representative of the American Baha'i community at the United Nations in New York City.
All right.
So one day a week I took the train into New York City, and then that actually led to a job offer from the Baha'i International Community United Nations office. And I was very excited to get that offer, so I gladly accepted, and I worked for 3 years at the Baha'i UN office as a specialist in human rights issues. And at that point, then, I knew I had to get a real career simply because I knew I couldn't. It would be very difficult to raise a family based upon the salary of a young employee of a nonprofit organization.
Okay.
And it was at that point that I began talking to a lot of diplomats at the UN and other people involved in the human rights field, and it turns out most of them had law degrees. So there I was, and found myself deciding to go to law school after all. And so then I wound up at Yale Law School and was there for 3 years.
Okay. Let's backtrack a bit, and then we'll get back to Yale Law School.
Sure.
You mentioned you were already a Baha'i in college. Were you raised as a Baha'i?
Yes, I was.
Okay.
Yeah, my parents became Baha'is when I was about a year old.
Okay.
So I like to joke that's when I became a Baha'i.
Okay. Now, what was their story in becoming a Baha'i?
Well, my father grew up in western Nebraska. And ironically, that's where I now happen to live, at least in Nebraska. I live in eastern Nebraska. But he grew up in a little town in western Nebraska and was raised as a Methodist. But he was very inquisitive about religion. And the first time he heard about the Baha'i faith, strangely enough, was in Sunday school class in the 1940s in this little town out in rural Nebraska. Apparently he had a rather forward-thinking Sunday school teacher who invited the class to study other religions, and a girl raised her hand and said, well, I have an aunt in Omaha who's a member of a really weird-sounding religion, Baha'i. And his teacher said, well, why don't you call her and find out more information? So she did, and that was the first time my dad had heard about it.
And how old was your dad?
Well, I think that must have been when he was maybe 12 or 13, around that age. And then he was best friends with another young man from Alliance, Nebraska, named Dan Jordan. And Dan Jordan went on to become a Rhodes Scholar. They were both musicians. Dan played the piano. My father played the cello. They played in many ensembles together as students. But Dan went on to become a Rhodes Scholar, went to Oxford, and he became a Baha'i. And he continued to correspond with my father, encouraging him to investigate the Baha'i faith. And as it happened, by this time, my dad was a student at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. And the Baha'is were just completing the construction of the Baha'i House of Worship right next door in Wilmette, Illinois. And so my father actually attended the dedication of the Baha'i House of Worship in Wilmette in 1953. He was not a Baha'i, but he was very interested, thanks to his friend and thanks to his early exposure in Sunday school class. Well, then my father traveled to California. Actually, he first traveled around Europe, 7th Army Symphony. Then he traveled to California, got a school teaching job. That's where he met my mother, who was also a school teacher. And he told her about the Baha'i faith, and she immediately became very excited. Now, she was from a Jewish background. She was a very devout Jew, and in fact, she taught religious classes at her synagogue. But she immediately responded to the message of the Baha'i faith, and the two of them then investigated it together, and they went to various Baha'i meetings, and they learned more, and really the Baha'i faith helped confirm the belief that they themselves had arrived at, that all the religions teach the same fundamental principles. So, as I mentioned, they became a Baha'i when I was about a year old. And then raised me with those same values.
Okay, well, let's go back to Yale Law School. You said you were only at Yale for 3 years.
Right.
Is that the typical?
Yeah, that's a typical law school education.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And I knew I was very interested in international law, and so I took as many international law courses as I could.
Mm-hmm.
And I was also interested, developed an interest at any rate in tax law.
Mm.
So I took a number of tax law courses and figured somehow I'd managed to combine these rather different areas of interest.
Mm.
Then I got a job working as a tax attorney in Philadelphia
Mm-hmm.
for 6 years. But really, by that time, my goal really was to become a law professor.
Mm.
And that was always my dream, having made the decision to suffer through and endure law school.
Mm.
So now I have a lifetime sentence in law school. I'll never get out of it, at least until I retire.
So why were you interested in tax law? What was it about tax law that interested you?
Well, I found it interesting at a number of levels. For one thing, it really has to do with basic concepts of social justice in terms of economic well-being.
Mm-hmm.
When we think about it, the tax system is one of the major social mechanisms we have to eliminate poverty
Mm-hmm.
and gross inequalities of wealth.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was very fascinated by it from that more ethical standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And I also discovered, as I studied it, that it's a very challenging field intellectually.
Mm.
It's very requires a very analytical mind. To be a tax attorney, one almost has to be a philosopher.
Mm.
And I think that aspect of it intrigued me. I originally thought about it because I met the husband of one of my colleagues at the Baha'i UN office, who was an international tax lawyer.
Mm.
And so I remember having lunch with him at the United Nations one day and learning about what he did, and it sounded very exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, in his particular job, he was traveling around the world negotiating tax agreements. And as I later learned, when you work for a law firm as a tax lawyer, you don't get to do too much traveling. But I think it was this concern for social justice, fairness, even the concept of trying to come up with a set of rules for taxation that accord with notions of fairness. And also, what intrigued me, too, is that tax law has been used as a means to encourage people to do good and discourage them from doing bad things. So I think at all those levels I found it interesting. But then I also, of course, had a long-standing interest in international law based on my Baha'i ideals and the fact that the Baha'i scriptures themselves talk about the need to develop a very strong system of international law.
Mm-hmm. Did you go directly to teaching from law school?
No, as I mentioned, I worked for 6 years as a
tax attorney,
practicing tax attorney in Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
So for better or for worse, I was a Philadelphia lawyer. And I enjoyed that. But I also maintained my interest in international human rights law. I was a member of the International Human Rights Law section of the Philadelphia Bar Association. Continued to do some volunteer work for the Baha'i UN office at the time. So managed to keep up with both interests, but I really was looking forward to going into teaching. And was fortunate to find a job at the University of Nebraska. So this is where I've been now for the last 11 years.
Okay, very good. And I guess you've written a couple of books?
Yes, just a few. So the ones that are, I think, most relevant at any rate to really the Baha'i faith and to world religions generally are a book first on the international legal rules governing humanitarian intervention. 4 years ago I wrote a book called Rethinking Humanitarian Intervention. Has a very long subtitle, but it's a fresh legal approach based on fundamental ethical principles in international law and world religions. And I was intrigued by the whole problem of when, if ever, is it appropriate to use military force to aid human rights victims. This is a question that's become a very hotly discussed issue ever since, really the early 1990s. when we had international intervention in Somalia to help assure the delivery of food supplies during a civil conflict there. Mm-hmm. In Bosnia, when we had not only a civil conflict, but what may have amounted to genocide, certainly ethnic cleansing going on. Mm-hmm. And there was a great deal of soul-searching on the part of the global community as to whether it should have acted more forcefully to protect victims of these atrocities. Mm-hmm. Rwanda was another example where there was a failure to intervene militarily, and of course then we had the bombing of Serbia in 1999 by NATO forces in an effort to dissuade the Serbian government from oppressing Albanian Kosovars. Mm-hmm. And so all of these situations, I think, created a great deal of controversy regarding the appropriateness of using military force. So I began looking at these legal problems under international law and the UN Charter, and quickly realized that the legal issues were very much intertwined with ethical issues, including, for example, is the use of force ever justified ethically, and also, do we ever have an actual obligation, perhaps, to use force to come to the rescue of others? Mm-hmm. And I knew that the religions of the world had a lot to say about these issues, but very few scholars, certainly coming from a legal background, had looked at what the world religions had to say. So that led me into an examination of the religious scriptures of the world. Mm-hmm. And of course, as a Baha'i, I had a belief, at any rate, that they taught many of the same basic ethical principles, mm-hmm. but I had not systematically investigated these commonalities. Mm-hmm. So I began doing research, corresponding with many experts on religion around the United States and around the world, and in the end wrote this book which tried to answer some of these legal questions, drawing on an ethical framework that incorporates both ethical principles that have found their way into contemporary international law, but also these common ethical principles in the world religions. Mm.
Give us an example of one situation that you could apply these ethical principles from the religious teachings to a particular instance in the last 10, 15 years.
Well, I think, for example, if we take what did occur in Rwanda, and which perhaps might occur and may be occurring right now in Darfur in the Sudan, what we see are mass murders, rapes, killings of innocent civilians, which may well amount to genocide. In fact, as perhaps you know, the U.S. government believes that what's going on in Darfur right now does constitute genocide. And in that kind of situation, a very important ethical problem is, do we have an obligation to intervene, to do what we reasonably can to rescue people who are being threatened with death or rape, what have you? And the scriptures of the world religions are all very much in agreement on this point, and they're very emphatic about it. That first, we do have a very strong duty to rescue others. In fact, anybody, anywhere on the planet who is under threat to their very survival. And secondly, the scriptures also, and this was something I found a bit surprising, all seem to allow for the use of some kind of force in these circumstances for the purpose of rescuing others. Not necessarily to rescue ourselves, but to rescue others as a kind of good Samaritan duty.
Can you give me an example?
Example
of a religious scripture that supports the idea of some sort of military force to help those that are...
Sure. Well, just to give you one example, there's a verse in the Quran, which is, of course, the holy book of Islam, which essentially says that if we see women or others who are actually men, women, and children who are being persecuted, then we have an obligation to, quote, fight in the way of God to protect them. And there are other passages as well from all the Scriptures. To take another example, if we look at the Hebrew Scriptures, we find the affirmation, this is from the book of Psalms, judge the wretched and the orphan, vindicate the lowly and the poor, rescue the wretched and the needy, save them from the hand of the wicked. And we even find a counsel in Proverbs that says, and this is another quote, if you refrain from rescuing those taken off to death, those condemned to slaughter, if you say, we knew nothing of it, surely he who fathoms hearts will discern the truth. He who watches over your life will know it, and he will pay each man as he deserves. So this verse seems to be saying that we will be accountable before God if we fail to rescue those condemned to slaughter, based on the excuse that, well, it's not really our business. We knew nothing of it.
So you figure that's what's keeping us as a set of nations from doing what we need to do?
I think so. And, just to also make clear that, based on the research I did on this first book, I collected so much evidence of these commonalities among the world's Scriptures, including on issues of intervention to rescue human rights victims, that I really felt that this evidence deserved to be in a book by itself. And so that's what led me to write my second book, Hope for a Global Ethic, Shared Principles in Religious Scriptures, which really examines these scriptural passages in some detail. And absolutely, one of the points I make in that book, both books actually, is that a primary, a foundational moral principle that we see in all the Scriptures is that we are all members of one human family, morally. And first and foremost, that is our primary identity. All the Scriptures express this idea of one global family. They may use different imagery. They may say we're all created as children of one God. They may invoke a concept of oneness, for example, in the Hindu Scriptures. The Baha'i writings, Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, says the earth is but one country and mankind its citizens. So we have this image that we are all citizens of one country, one nation. So at any rate, no matter what the metaphor, if you will, all the Scriptures are emphatic that we are all related morally. We are all members of one family. And so an injury to any family member, even halfway around the globe, we should feel as if it were an injury to our immediate family. And we should act accordingly. So I think you're absolutely right. I think what's keeping us from acting courageously and effectively in places like Darfur is this mental defense that we set up. Well, that's Africa. Those people are not like us. They're not members of our family. And so we don't have strong obligations to help them.
The focus of the first book, then, is sort of just the call from the religious Scriptures that indeed we need to intervene, or what would you say?
The focus of the first book is on legal issues.
Okay.
In the course of that book, I do cite a few examples from the world Scriptures to support similar ethical principles that are now found in international law. But really that book is very much legal in its orientation. And the second book, Hope for a Global Ethic, published by Baha'i Publishing, really delves deeply into the Scriptures themselves. And in that book I make the argument that we can actually go a very long way towards solving the world's problems by looking again with a fresh eye at the world's great Scriptures, and in particular with an eye to seeing these convergences instead of seeing all the differences that, unfortunately, religionists have been fighting over for so long. And even if we focus on the religions themselves, I think we can find many moral principles that will allow us to resolve some difficult dilemmas. That doesn't mean that there will always be a crystal clear answer. But one of the principles that I identify in all the Scriptures is the principle of open-minded consultation. The idea that we can often solve difficult problems by consulting with one another, and that involves an attitude of humility and openness to different perspectives. It's only by appreciating those different perspectives that we can come up with a solution that is really ethically sound, but also practical. So that's another theme that I develop in my book, Hope for Global Ethics.
The first book that dealt with the legal issues, from what framework were you talking? Are you referring to as far as legal issues? The law of the United States, international law?
That was focused on international law. That was focused in particular on the United Nations Charter, most importantly. But also I looked at international human rights law, which, of course, is grounded in the UN Charter, which says that the fundamental purpose of the UN is to promote human rights, but also in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted by the United Nations in 1948 and has now spawned many, many human rights treaties. And the U.S. is now a party to many of these treaties and is therefore bound by them, at least under international law. So I looked at really the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and other international human rights law, and the implications of these ethical principles for how we interpret and apply that international law. So just to give you one example, the problem is that if we look at a lot of these documents, we see contradictory principles. So on the one hand, the UN Charter says that one of its purposes is to promote human rights. On the other hand, it affirms the sovereign equality of all of its members, so it uses this word sovereignty. And it also asserts that the UN shall not interfere in any matters that are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any country. And at least historically, that has been understood to include human rights matters. So we have, on the one hand, norms promoting human rights, and on the other hand, norms promoting sovereignty, non-intervention in the affairs of other states, not to mention norms that generally prohibit one state from using force against another, with very limited exceptions, like self-defense. But certainly there's no explicit permission for any state to intervene militarily in any other simply because that other state is committing gross human rights violations. You see, this falls within the cracks of the UN Charter. There are no explicit rules on so-called humanitarian intervention, and that's why it's given rise to such controversy. And we can see this reflected, of course, also even in the Iraq War, which has been justified by some observers as a humanitarian intervention, as an intervention to rescue victims of a despotic regime.
Although that wasn't the premise.
No, that was, not the original premise.
That's not the official premise, so to speak.
It was a mixture of rationales.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
But now this is one of the primary rationales, and so, again, that's evidently been quite controversial.
Right, yes.
And it's quite controversial as to whether that is legal under international law. So I didn't, of course, I wrote my book before that event, my first book, but at any rate, I was trying to resolve some of these contradictions within the UN Charter and other international legal documents by reference to ethical principles based on this idea of the unity of the human family. That's the first and foremost principle that I rely on in both books, really. And in Hope for Global Ethic, I try to expand on this idea and demonstrate how it is reflected and articulated in all of the world's great religious scriptures.
Now, what conclusion do you come to with the first book? Is it just that there is this gray area and that it's the religious teachings that tend to fill in that gray area? Or
Well, I address very specific issues and try to resolve the gray area. And I resolve it in light of this ethical principle of the unity of the human family, which is common both to international law. For example, the very first article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that we should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. So right there we have this idea that were members of one family, even in international law. But then I buttress that and show that this international law moral principle is strongly supported by the world's great religions. And I think that gives this idea of the unity of the human family a lot more moral force as well as practical force, the fact that you find support for it in all the religions.
Mm-hmm.
And so I address a whole series of difficult legal issues, ranging from the use of force to obligations to intervene. I argue that there may well be obligations to intervene. However, those obligations need to be carried out through the legal mechanisms that have been developed under the United Nations, and at least from a legal standpoint. And so, in a sense, these ethical principles strengthen the mechanisms that we already have in the UN Charter and really urge us to comply with those mechanisms. And I look at a whole range of other issues, including reform of the United Nations to make it more effective in protecting people against genocide and other gross human rights abuses. So I use these ethical principles as a framework to then come up with ideas for practical reforms.
So I'm speaking with Brian Lepard, author of Rethinking Humanitarian Intervention, a fresh legal approach based on fundamental ethical principles in international law and world religions. And that's your first book, correct?
Yes.
And then your second book also is Hope for a Global Ethic.
Shared Principles in Religious Scriptures. And that second book is the one that's written for a general audience.
Okay.
And so I think most readers will find that second book a little bit easier of a read.
Okay. Yeah. So what's your plans for the future, Brian?
Well, I'm working on a number of projects, actually, at the moment, both professionally and personally. And fortunately, there's been a lot of receptivity to the ideas in my books. And Hope for a Global Ethic, for example, has led to an opportunity to co-author a book on the influence of religion and religious teachings on the development of international law, the development of ideas concerning world peace and human rights. So I'm collaborating on this new book with two other international law professors who, having read Hope for Global Ethic, invited me to join them on this project. I also have a number of other book projects, including one on religion and human rights and the positive contribution that religion can make to respect for human rights. So those are a number of the professional projects that I think have been really inspired by my work, including Hope for Global Ethics.
You also mentioned some personal projects?
Yes. Well, I'm in the process, actually, of writing a book that will be an introduction to the Baha'i faith for Christians, based in part on my research for all of these other books. I've had the opportunity to learn a lot from experts in Christianity, learn a lot about the Bible, and so as a personal project, I felt it might be helpful to draw on some of those contacts that I've had and write a book that would be a basic introduction to the Baha'i faith for Christians. So that's a personal project, if you will. But I'm very excited, though, about the potential for members of all religions and even of no religion to work together to solve the world's problems by going back to the basic principles in their own scriptures, which I think have a great potential to help us grapple with these very challenging issues that we're facing today.
Now, you had mentioned earlier in the interview that after undergraduate school, you worked for the Baha'i International Community.
Yes.
Could you explain a little bit of what that organization does?
Sure. Well, ever since the founding of the United Nations, the Baha'is have been strong supporters of the UN, precisely because it is an attempt to implement the Baha'i ideal of global cooperation And there were Baha'is, for example, represented at the San Francisco conference, where the UN was created. But from the very earliest days of the UN, the Baha'is have had a relationship with it. And in particular, the worldwide Baha'i community has enjoyed a very special status with the UN. It's called consultative status, meaning that Baha'i representatives may participate in the work of certain UN bodies, including those dealing with human rights issues, not to mention others as well, such as women's issues. So there's a very strong presence at the UN, a strong Baha'i presence, and I was hired as a special assistant in human rights. So I researched a wide variety of human rights issues that the UN is dealing with and tried to articulate a Baha'i perspective on those issues in statements that were delivered to the United Nations at various meetings around the world. And so, of course, that work continues today, and there's a very well-staffed office at the UN. In fact, the Baha'i International Community UN office has won a very impressive reputation among other non-governmental organizations. So certainly for many years, for example, other non-governmental organizations have elected the Baha'i International Community to chair the Committee on Human Rights, on which all so-called NGOs, non-governmental organizations interested in human rights, are represented. Those include organizations like Amnesty International and so forth. So the Baha'is have often chaired that committee, and they have also been elected frequently to chair a committee of religious organizations. So the Baha'i international community has a very high visibility at the UN.
And you had mentioned some statements that you had worked on while you were there to sort of formulate a position.
Yes.
Could you describe some of those?
Sure. Well, these statements deal with a wide variety of human rights issues that the UN is concerned about. For example, the UN has long been concerned about eliminating racism and achieving racial equality. In fact, in 1965, it adopted a treaty on the elimination of racial discrimination. So there have been a number of global conferences on how to eliminate racism, and at the time I was there, which is a long time ago by now, they had a Second World Conference on Racism. Of course, now we've had more than that, but I prepared a statement for that conference. We were very closely involved with the drafting of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and so the Baha'i international community frequently contributed to the draft, at least contributed suggestions regarding the drafting of that treaty, and a number of those statements I helped to write. Of course, I should make it very clear that all of these statements are, although I might have been personally involved in helping to write them, they are statements of the Baha'i international community, and ultimately are, of course, approved and by relevant Baha'i institutions. So they really are, the institutional voice of the Baha'i world community. I also assisted in writing statements on issues involving rights of indigenous peoples.
In your press release for the book Hope for a Global Ethic, and you said there's a subtitle to that? Yeah,
Shared Principles in Religious Scriptures. Yeah, it actually was omitted from the cover of the book, and I think that might
was
have
the
been
problem.
Inadvertent.
Okay.
If you look on the inside title page, it'll be there. But
this press release poses a couple of questions here. One is, how then does humanity solve the horrendous problems of terrorism, war, and gross violations of human rights? Do you answer that question in the book?
Well, I don't give any nice and simple, cut and dry answers because there are none.
Right.
But I certainly suggest that by turning to these ethical principles in the world's religions, we can begin to figure out how to address these problems, and in particular through consultation. And I think that what we find when we delve into the scriptures is really a quite sophisticated set of moral principles. They're all grounded in this idea of the unity of the human family, but they really are quite sophisticated and ultimately one concludes there are no very simple answers, but for a good, for a starting point, simple recognition of this concept of the unity of the human family would get us very far.
Yeah.
And we were alluding to that earlier.
Right.
At least in addressing a problem like the terrible atrocities going on in Darfur, at least if we start with the proposition that these victims are members of the same family, that can get us very far in deciding how do we respond.
Right.
Or, just to take other examples, if we address the roots of terrorism or fanaticism, for example, committed in the name of Islam, among other religions, if we understand, first, the principle of the unity of religions and the unity of the human family, and secondly, if we investigate the Quran, as I try to do in Hope for Global Ethic, to find out what it really teaches about how to treat those who are not Muslims, we very readily conclude that there is no justification for terrorism committed in the name of Islam. The only justification is through perversion of a very few isolated passages, and in the book I do, of course, discuss some of those passages, but the vast majority of the verses of the Quran very clearly say that it is impermissible to use force against anybody who is not themselves an aggressor, that is to say an innocent civilian. And in fact, many of the earliest rules, even of international law involving protection of civilians, were influenced by these Islamic teachings. So, in other words, if we look at these scriptures with kind of this fresh point of view, it helps us to be quite clear about what the roots of these problems are and what the roots are not. So I think, for example, it becomes very clear that the problem is not Islam in terms of dealing with so-called Islamic terrorism. The problem is fanaticism. The problem is really a total denial of the fundamental teachings of the Quran by those who commit terrorism in the name of Islam. And that helps us identify the source of the problem and then also identify solutions. We also see that Christians and Muslims and Jews and Baha'is, we all do share the same fundamental teachings, at least when we go back to our scriptures. And you see, that knowledge itself can help us go very far in figuring out how to respond to many of these problems. And at a minimum, of course, it indicates that people of all religions do need to cooperate to solve them, and that the whole world needs to cooperate to solve them.
So, Brian, what's your vision of the future for the world?
Well, it's hard to separate that from my beliefs as a Baha'i. And as a Baha'i, I believe, based on the teachings of Baha'u'llah, that, in fact, the world has a very glorious destiny. And Baha'u'llah himself promises that soon will these ruinous wars pass away, and the most great peace shall come. So there's a promise that ultimately the world will achieve world peace. So my view is colored by that optimism that I feel as a Baha'i. At the same time, the Baha'i teachings are quite clear that the world must suffer so long as humanity turns away from these fundamental moral principles. And currently, as we know, as I just explained, for example, with respect to terrorism, this represents a turning away, a challenge to, and a defiance of these basic ethical teachings. So, in a sense, the Baha'i teachings are also quite realistic, if you will, about the short-term future. That is to say, we can already see really the breakdown of the existing social order because it fails to fully implement these shared ethical principles. You know, Baha'u'llah said that the winds of despair are alas blowing from every direction, and the strife that divideth and afflicteth the human race is daily increasing. And we see that today. But we also know that if humanity can turn towards these teachings and resolve to work together to promote peace and justice, we can solve these problems, and there will be a glorious future for humanity. So those are my views, too.
Very good. Well, Brian, thank you very much. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed that interview with Brian Lepard, a Baha'i and a professor of law at the University of Nebraska, and author of Hope for a Global Ethic, Shared Principles in Religious Scripture. For a copy of this and other interviews, you're welcome to go to the website www.abahaiperspective.com. For information specifically on the Baha'i Faith, you can go to the website www.baha'i.org, or you can call the toll-free number 1-800-22-UNITE.